The music stopped. A sharp, resounding slap echoed through the garden, silencing the murmurs of the guests. All eyes turned to the stage where Julian Torres stood, cheeks stinging, staring into his mother's furious eyes. It was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. Julian, 27, had spent months planning this wedding with Ezra Nguyen, the man who taught him how to love without fear. Under the floral arch in this upstate New York garden, with sunlight streaming through the trees, they were moments away from their vows. But now, Maria Torres, Julian's mother, stood before him, her hands still raised, her face a mask of betrayal. "You disgrace us," she hissed, her voice low but venomous, carrying to the front rows. "How could you do this to our family?" The crowd of 200 guests froze, their champagne flutes suspended midair. Ezra, standing beside Julian, tightened his grip on his fiancée's hand, his jaw clenched. Julian's heart pounded, not from the slap, but from the weight of the moment. Everything he'd fought for, everything he'd hidden, was unraveling. He'd always known his mother's love came with conditions. Growing up in their tight-knit Puerto Rican community in Brooklyn, Julian had learned early to bury parts of himself. Maria was a pillar of that world, devout, proud, and unyielding. She'd raised him and his sister, Sophia, alone after their father left, her strength both a shield and a cage. When Julian came out at 19, Maria hadn't spoken to him for a year. He'd clawed his way back in her life, but her acceptance was fragile, a thin veneer over her disapproval. Today, that veneer had shattered. "Maria, stop," Ezra said, stepping forward, his voice steady but sharp. At 29, Ezra was a quiet force, a Vietnamese-American artist whose calm exterior hid a fierce protectiveness. His cream tuxedo glowed in the sunlight, but his eyes were stormy. "This is our day. You don't get to ruin it." Maria's gaze snapped to Ezra, her lips curling. You did this to him. He was fine before you." Julian's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to tell her she was wrong, that Ezra had saved him from a life of pretending. But his voice caught, trapped by years of guilt and shame she'd instilled in him. The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispers rippling through the crowd. Sophia, Julian's younger sister, stood at the edge of the stage, her face pale, torn between her brother and their mother. The officiant, a kind-eyed woman in her 60s, cleared her throat, attempting to regain control. "Perhaps we should." "No," Julian said, his voice finally breaking free. He touched his stinging cheek, the pain grounding him. "No, we're doing this. Ezra, I'm ready." Ezra's eyes softened, but before he could respond, Maria stepped closer, her voice rising. "You think you could just stand here and pretend this is normal? That this is what God wants? I raised you better, Julian." The words cut deeper than the slap. Julian's vision blurred, not with tears, but with a flood of memories. Hiding his first crush, lying about where he was going on Saturday nights, the nights he cried alone in his room, praying to be different. He'd spent years trying to make his mother proud, but her love always came with a price, his truth. Ezra's hand squeezed his, grounding him again. "Julian," he whispered, "you don't have to do this alone." But Julian felt alone, standing on that stage, caught between the man he loved and the mother who'd shaped him. The guests watched, some with pity, others with curiosity, as if this were a play unfolding before them. He could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment, the unspoken questions. Could he really go through with this? Could he choose Ezra over his family, his heritage, his past? Then, from the crowd, a voice broke the tension. "Enough, Maria." It was Tia Carmen, Julian's aunt, pushing her way to the front. Her silver hair glinted in the sunlight, and her eyes burned with a fierceness that matched her sister's. "You don't get to decide his happiness." "Not today." Maria spun toward her, incredulous. "You're defending this? You know what this means for us, for our family's name." Carmen didn't flinch. "It means he's brave. Braver than you." The words hung in the air, a challenge. Julian's throat tightened, gratitude and fear warring inside him. He looked at Ezra, whose steady gaze reminded him why they were here. This wasn't just about them. It was about every moment they'd fought for, every secret they'd shared, every dream they'd built together in their tiny Brooklyn apartment. Julian took a shaky breath and faced his mother. "I love him, Mommy. I've always loved him. And I'm not sorry." Maria's face crumpled, a mix of anger and something softer, grief maybe. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time, Julian saw her not as the unbreakable matriarch, but as a woman wrestling with her own fears. The officiant stepped forward, sensing the moment. "Shall we continue?" she asked gently. Julian nodded, his hand still in Ezra's. But as they turned to face the crowd, a man stood up in the back row, his face obscured by the glare of the sun. He was older, in his 60s, with a weathered face and a suit that looked out of place among the wedding finery. He cleared his throat, and his voice carried across the garden, low and deliberate. "Before you do, there's something you all need to know." The crowd turned, gasps rippling through the guests. Julian's heart sank. He didn't recognize the man, but the weight in his voice told him this wasn't just an interruption. It was a detonation, waiting to go off. Ezra leaned close, his voice a whisper. "Who is that?" Julian shook his head, his pulse racing. "I don't know." But as the man stepped forward, his eyes locked on Maria, and Julian saw something flicker in his mother's face, recognition and fear. Whatever truth was about to explode, it wasn't just about Julian and Ezra. It was bigger, older, and buried deep in the family Maria had fought so hard to protect. The man's footsteps crunched on the gravel path as he approached the stage, each step amplifying the tension in the air. Julian's grip on Ezra's hand tightened, his mind racing. Who was this stranger, and why did his mother look like she'd seen a ghost? Maria's face, usually a fortress of composure, was unraveling, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. "Sit down, Victor," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried a plea. The crowd stirred, confused, as the name hung in the air. Victor. Julian's stomach twisted. He'd heard that name before, in hushed arguments between his mother and Tia Carmen late at night, when they thought he was asleep. But it was a shadow, a fragment of a story never fully told. Victor stopped at the edge of the stage, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. He was tall, with a slight stoop, his gray hair thinning, but his presence commanding. "I've been quiet too long, Maria," he said, his voice steady but heavy with regret. "You can't keep running from this." Ezra leaned toward Julian, his breath warm against his ear. "Is that your father?" The question hit like a punch. Julian's father, Ricardo, had left when he was 5, a hazy memory of rough laughter and cigarette smoke. Maria had erased him from their lives, claiming he was a deadbeat who'd abandoned them. But this man, Victor, didn't match the vague image in Julian's mind. "Who are you?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking. The guests were riveted, their earlier discomfort now replaced by raw curiosity. Sophia, still at the stage's edge, took a step forward, her eyes darting between her mother and the stranger. Victor's gaze softened as he looked at Julian. "I'm someone who should have been here sooner," he said. "I'm your uncle, your father's brother." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through the crowd. Julian's knees buckled, but Ezra's arm steadied him. "Uncle?" His father had never mentioned a brother. Maria had never mentioned a brother. The lies, the omissions pressed against Julian's chest, making it hard to breathe. Maria stepped forward, her voice sharp now. "You have no right, Victor. Not here. Not now." Then when Victor shot back, his tone rising. "You've buried the truth for 20 years. You think you can slap your son and call it love? You think you can erase the past?" The guests gasped, some leaning forward, others whispering furiously. Tia Carmen moved closer, her hand on Maria's arm, but Maria shook her off. "Don't," she warned her sister, her voice trembling with fury. "You've always taken his side." "Whose side?" Julian interrupted, his voice louder than he intended. What are you all talking about? He felt like he was drowning in secrets, each one pulling him further from the life he thought he knew. Victor turned to the crowd, his expression grim. This isn't just about Julian and Ezra, he said. It's about why I left this family, why Ricardo left, and why Maria's been lying to you all. Maria's face drained of color. Stop, she said, but it was more plea than command now. Julian's heart raced. He glanced at Ezra, whose eyes were fixed on Victor, searching for answers. Sophia, tears brimming, clutched the edge of her dress, her loyalty torn. Victor took a deep breath, his voice steadying. Your father didn't abandon you, Julian. He was forced out by Maria because he was like you. The words hit Julian like a freight train. Like me, gay. His father was gay. The garden spun around him, the flowers, the guests, the sunlight, all blurring into a haze. Ezra's arm tightened around him, anchoring him to the moment. That's a lot, Maria shouted, her voice cracking. Ricardo was a coward who ran from his responsibilities. Was he? Victor countered, stepping onto the stage now, his presence towering despite his age. Or did you make his life hell until he had no choice but to leave? You knew who he was, Maria. You knew before you married him. The crowd was silent now, the weight of the revelation suffocating. Julian's mind raced, piecing together fragments of his childhood, his father's long absences, the fights behind closed doors, Maria's coldness toward him even as a boy. Had she known then, too? Had she seen it in him, her own son, and hated him for it? Ezra's voice broke through Julian's spiral. Julian, look at me. His brown eyes were steady, a lifeline. Whatever this is, we'll face it together. Okay. Julian nodded, but his throat was tight. He turned to Victor. Why are you here? Why now? Victor's expression softened, but there was pain in his eyes. Because I couldn't let you go through this alone. I was at your father's wedding, too. I saw what it did to him, hiding who he was. I won't let Maria do the same to you. Maria's hands shook as she pointed at Victor. You're poisoning my son with your lies. You and Ricardo, always so weak, always running from duty. Duty. Victor's voice rose, raw with anger. You call it duty to force a man to live a lie? To make him ashamed of who he loves? You broke Ricardo, Maria, and you're trying to break Julian, too. The guests were no longer whispering. They were openly staring, some with tears, others with shock. Sophia stepped onto the stage, her voice trembling. Mommy, is this true? Did you make Poppy leave? Maria's eyes darted to her daughter, then to Julian, then back to Victor. For the first time, she looked small, cornered. I did what was best for this family, she said, but her voice wavered. I protected us. Protected us? Julian's voice was raw, years of pain spilling out. You made me feel like I was wrong my whole life, like I wasn't enough. And now you're saying you did the same to my father. Maria's lips parted, but no words came. The officiant, sensing the moment spiraling, raised her hands. Perhaps we should take a moment. No, Ezra said, his voice firm. This needs to happen. Julian deserves the truth. Victor nodded, his eyes on Julian. Your father loved you. He wanted to stay, but Maria gave him an ultimatum. Leave his sinful life or lose you and Sophia. He chose to protect you from her wrath, but it broke him. Julian's vision blurred with tears now. He could barely process the words. His father hadn't abandoned him. He'd been pushed away, just like Julian had been, all these years. The weight of it was crushing, but Ezra's hand in his kept him grounded. Julian, Ezra said softly, what do you want to do? Julian looked at the crowd, at his mother's trembling form, at Victor's steady gaze, at Sophia's tear-streaked face. He wanted to run, to hide from the truth, but he'd spent too long hiding. This was his wedding, his moment, his life. I want to marry you, he said to Ezra, his voice steady despite the chaos. And I want the truth. All of it. Victor nodded, a faint smile breaking through his grief. Then let's start with this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope, its edges yellowed with age. Julian's heart stopped as Victor held it out to him. "This is from your father," he said. "He wrote it before he left. For you." Julian's hand trembled as he took the envelope from Victor. The paper felt fragile, like it might crumble under the weight of the moment. His name was scrawled across the front in a handwriting he didn't recognize, but the sight of it sent a shiver down his spine. His father's words, locked away for 2 decades, were now in his hands. Ezra stood close, his presence a quiet anchor as Julian stared at the envelope. The crowd was silent, the tension palpable, every guest hanging on the edge of this unfolding drama. Maria's eyes were fixed on the envelope, her face a mix of fear and defiance. Sophia, still on the stage, wiped her tears, her gaze flickering between her brother and their mother. "Open it," Ezra whispered, his voice gentle but firm. "You need to know." Julian nodded, his fingers clumsy as he tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, the ink faded but legible. He unfolded it, his heart pounding, and began to read aloud, his voice unsteady but growing stronger with each word. "My dearest Julian, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I'm so sorry. I wanted to be there, to watch you grow, to see the man you'd become. But your mother and we couldn't find a way to make it work. Not because I didn't love you or Sophia, but because I couldn't be the man she wanted. I'm gay, Julian. I've known it since I was a boy, but I hid it thinking it was the only way to have a family, to be right. I was wrong. I married your mother to please her, to please our community, but it was a lie that hurt us all. When she found out, she gave me a choice, leave my truth or lose you. I chose to leave, not because I didn't love you, but because I couldn't let her hate poison you. I hope one day you'll forgive me. I hope you'll be braver than I was. Live your truth, Julian. Love who you love, and don't let anyone make you ashamed. Your father, Ricardo." Julian's voice broke on the last word. Tears streamed down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. The letter felt like a lifeline, a connection to a man he'd barely known, but now understood in a way he never had. The crowd was silent, some guests wiping their own tears, others staring at Maria, whose face was unreadable. Ezra pulled Julian close, his arms wrapping around him. "He loved you," he whispered. "He wanted you to be free." Julian nodded, clutching the letter to his chest. He looked at his mother, who stood rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice raw. "Did you make him leave because he was gay?" Maria's lips trembled, but she didn't answer. Her silence was louder than any confession. Sophia stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Mommy, say something, please." Victor spoke instead, his voice heavy with years of unspoken pain. She knew before they married, Julian. Ricardo told her, thinking she'd understand. But she saw it as a sin, a flaw to be fixed. When he couldn't change, she pushed him out. I tried to help him, but he was broken by then. He died 5 years ago, alone. The crowd gasped, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Julian's knees buckled, but Ezra held him up. His father was gone. The man who'd written this letter, who'd loved him despite everything, was gone. The grief was sharp, but so was the anger. "You let me think he didn't want me," Julian said, his voice rising as he faced his mother. "You let me grow up thinking I was abandoned, that I wasn't enough. And all this time, you were punishing him for being like me." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was defiant. "I did what I had to do. For you, for Sophia, for our family's honor. You don't understand the shame, the judgment we faced." "Shame?" Julian shouted, his voice echoing through the garden. "The only shame here is how you treated him. How you're treating me." The guests were no longer silent. Whispers turned to murmurs, some nodding in support, others shaking their heads. Tia Carmen stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Maria, you can't keep doing this. You're losing your son, just like you lost Ricardo." Maria's face crumpled, and for the first time, Julian saw something break in her. She sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. Sophia knelt beside her, torn between comforting her mother and standing with her brother. Ezra turned to Julian, his eyes fierce with love. "This is your day," he said. "You decide what happens next." Julian looked at the letter in his hand, then at the crowd, then at his mother. The weight of his father's words burned in his chest. Live your truth. He'd spent his life hiding, pleasing, compromising. No more. "I want to finish this," he said, his voice steady now. "I want to marry Ezra. Right now." The officiant nodded, her expression a mix of relief and admiration. "Very well," she said, raising her voice to address the crowd. "Let's continue." But before she could speak, Maria stood, her face streaked with tears. "Wait," she said, her voice barely audible. All eyes turned to her, the air thick with anticipation. "I need to say something." Julian braced himself, expecting another outburst, another rejection. But Maria's shoulders slumped, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, broken. "I was wrong," she said. "I thought I was protecting you, Julian. But I was protecting myself. From what people would say, from what I was taught to believe. I don't know how to fix this." The admission hung in the air, raw and fragile. Julian's heart ached, torn between anger and the flicker of hope her words sparked. He wanted to believe her, but years of pain made it hard. Sophia stood, taking her mother's hand. "Mommy, you can start by being here, by letting Julian be happy." Maria looked at her daughter, then at Julian, her eyes searching his face. "Can you forgive me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Julian didn't answer right away. He looked at Ezra, whose steady gaze gave him strength. He thought of his father's letter, of the man who'd loved him enough to let him go. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but maybe it was a start. "I don't know," Julian said honestly, "but I want you to stay. I want you to see me marry the man I love." Maria nodded, tears falling freely now. She sat back down, Sophia beside her, and the crowd let out a collective breath. The officiant smiled, her voice warm as she began again. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." As she spoke, Julian felt Ezra's hand in his, solid and sure. The weight of the past was still there, but so was the promise of the future. He glanced at the letter, still clutched in his hand, and silently promised his father, "I'll live my truth." The officiant's voice flowed over the garden, steady and soothing, pulling the fractured moment back together. "We are gathered here to celebrate the union of Julian Torres and Ezra Nguyen, two souls who have chosen to walk this life together." Julian's heart pounded, but this time it was with anticipation, not fear. Ezra's hand was warm in his, a reminder that they'd made it through the storm, at least for now. The guests, still reeling from the earlier confrontation, settled into their seats, their faces a mix of awe and uncertainty. Maria sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the ground. Sophia sat beside her, one hand on her mother's arm, her gaze flickering between Julian and Ezra with quiet pride. Victor stood at the edge of the stage, his expression unreadable, but his presence a silent support. Julian stole a glance at Ezra, whose sharp cheekbones caught the golden light of a late afternoon. Ezra's lips curved into a small, reassuring smile, and Julian felt the knot in his chest loosen. This was why they were here, not for the guests, not for his mother's approval, but for each other, for the love they'd built against all odds. The officiant continued, her voice warm. "Before we proceed with the vows, Julian and Ezra have chosen to share their own words. Julian, would you like to begin?" Julian took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the letter still in his hand. He'd prepared vows weeks ago, memorized them in their tiny Brooklyn apartment, practicing in front of the mirror while Ezra teased him for being too serious. But now, standing here, those words felt small compared to the weight of the moment. He turned to Ezra, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling in his chest. "Ezra, I spent so long hiding who I was, thinking I had to earn love by being someone else. You showed me I was enough. You stood by me when I was scared, when I doubted myself, when I thought I'd lose everything. Today, I'm not just promising to love you. I'm promising to be brave, to fight for us, no matter what. You're my home, and I'll spend every day making sure you know it. Ezra's eyes glistened, but his smile was radiant. He squeezed Julian's hand, his voice low but clear when he spoke. Julian, you're the strongest person I know. Not because you never falter, but because you keep going even when it hurts. You make me want to be better, to create, to love without limits. I promise to hold your hand through every storm, to remind you who you are when you forget, and to build a life with you that's honest and true. I love you always. The crowd let out a soft, collective sigh, some guests dabbing at their eyes. Julian's throat tightened, but he smiled, the warmth of Ezra's words wrapping around him like a blanket. The officiant beamed. Beautifully said. Now the rings. Sophia stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly as she handed the rings to the officiant. She caught Julian's eye and mouthed, "I'm proud of you." Julian's heart swelled. His sister had always been his ally, even when she didn't fully understand. He nodded back, grateful. The officiant held up the rings, simple gold bands that gleamed in the sunlight. These rings are a symbol of your commitment, a circle unbroken, a promise eternal. Julian, place the ring on Ezra's finger and repeat after me. Julian took the ring, his hand steady now. He slid it onto Ezra's finger, his voice clear. With this ring, I thee wed, and I promise to love, honor, and cherish you all the days of my life. Ezra's smile widened as he took the second ring, sliding it onto Julian's finger. With this ring, I thee wed, and I promise to love, honor, and cherish you all the days of my life. The officiant raised her hands, her voice ringing out. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you married. You may kiss. The crowd erupted into applause as Julian pulled Ezra close, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like a victory. It was soft at first, then fierce, a declaration to the world that they'd chosen each other, no matter the cost. The guests cheered louder, some standing, others clapping with tears in their eyes. But as Julian and Ezra pulled apart, their hands still intertwined, Julian's gaze drifted to his mother. Maria was still seated, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, grief, guilt, and something softer, almost like regret. She didn't clap, but she didn't look away either. It was a small thing, but it felt like a crack in the wall she'd built. Victor approached the stage, his eyes warm as he clapped Julian on the shoulder. Your father will be proud, he said quietly. You're braver than he ever was. Julian nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He tucked the letter into his pocket, a piece of his father he'd carry forever. Ezra squeezed his hand, pulling him back to the moment. Ready for the reception? He asked, his voice teasing but warm. Julian laughed, the sound surprising even himself. Yeah, let's do this. The reception was set up in a nearby tent, its walls draped with fairy lights and flowers. As the guests moved toward it, music began to play, a lively jazz tune that broke the lingering tension. Julian and Ezra led the way, hand in hand, their smiles infectious. Sophia followed close behind, linking arms with Tia Carmen, who was wiping tears from her eyes. But as they reached the tent, a young woman approached, her face hesitant but determined. She was in her late 20s, with short, dyed blue hair and a suit that matched Ezra's cream tuxedo. Julian, she said, her voice soft. I'm Lena. I knew your father. Julian froze, his heart skipping a beat. Ezra's hand tightened on his, a silent question. Knew him how? Julian asked, his voice cautious. Lena's eyes were kind but sad. He was my mentor. I'm an artist like Ezra. Ricardo helped me when I was struggling, when my own family turned their backs on me. He talked about you all the time. He wanted you to know he never stopped loving you. Julian's breath caught. Another piece of his father, another truth unfolding. He glanced at Ezra, who nodded encouragingly. Thank you. Julian said, his voice thick. Will you stay for the reception? Tell me more. Lena smiled, nodding. I'd like that. As they entered the tent, the music swelled, and the crowd's energy lifted. Julian felt the weight of the day, his mother's slap, Victor's revelation, his father's letter. But he also felt the lightness of Ezra's love, Sophia's support, and the unexpected gift of Lena's words. The truth was messy, painful, but it was his, and for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The reception tent glowed with warmth, fairy lights casting a soft shimmer over the round tables adorned with white linens and vibrant peonies. The jazz band played a lively rendition of Fly Me to the Moon, and guests began to mingle, their earlier shock giving way to celebration. Julian and Ezra stood at the center of it all, their hands still clasped, their smiles a quiet defiance against the chaos of the ceremony. Julian's eyes scanned the room, landing on Maria, who sat at a table near the edge of the tent, her posture stiff. Sophia was beside her, whispering something, but Maria's gaze was distant, lost in her own thoughts. Julian's heart ached. He wanted to hate her for what she'd done, to his father, to him, but the memory of her broken admission on the stage lingered. I was wrong. Those words, fragile as they were, had shifted something in him. Ezra nudged him gently, pulling him back. Dance with me, he said, his voice low and playful. Let's remind them why we're here. Julian grinned, letting Ezra lead him to the dance floor. The band transitioned into a slower tune, a soulful cover of At Last. Ezra pulled Julian close, their bodies swaying in sync, and for a moment, the world shrank to just the two of them. Julian rested his forehead against Ezra's, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. I love you, he whispered. I know, Ezra teased, his lips brushing Julian's ear. You're stuck with me now. The guests watched, some smiling, others whispering, but Julian didn't care. This was his truth, his joy, and no one, not even his mother, could take it away. As the song ended, the crowd applauded, and Ezra kissed him softly, sparking another round of cheers. Lena approached as they stepped off the dance floor, a glass of champagne in her hand. You two are beautiful together, she said, her smile genuine. Ricardo would have loved this. Julian's chest tightened at the mention of his father. Tell me about him, he said, guiding her to a quiet corner of the tent. Ezra followed, his presence a steady comfort. Lena sat across from them, her expression softening. Ricardo was complicated. He was a brilliant photographer, always chasing light, you know? But he carried so much guilt. He talked about you and Sophia constantly, about how he wished he could have stayed. He kept a photo of you in his wallet, a little boy with big curls, holding a toy camera. Julian's throat closed, the image vivid in his mind. He remembered that camera, a cheap plastic thing his father had given him for his 4th birthday. I still have it, he said quietly. In a box somewhere. Lena's eyes brightened. He'd be so happy to know that. He wanted you to see the world the way he did, through a lens finding beauty in the mess. Ezra squeezed Julian's hand. Sounds like someone else I know, he said, his voice warm. Julian managed a small smile, but the weight of his father's absence pressed against him. He glanced across the tent at Maria, who was now talking to Tia Carmen, her expression still guarded. Did he ever try to come back? Julian asked Lena, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded, her gaze distant. He did once, about 10 years ago. He came to Brooklyn, stood outside your house for hours, but he couldn't bring himself to knock. He said Maria had made it clear he wasn't welcome, and he didn't want to hurt you or Sophia by dragging up the past. Julian's heart sank. His father had been so close, and he'd never known. He looked at Ezra, whose eyes were filled with quiet understanding. He loved you, Ezra said softly. That's what matters. Julian nodded, but the anger was still there, simmering beneath the grief. He stood, needing air, and Ezra followed him outside the tent. The evening air was cool, the sky streaked with pink and orange. Julian leaned against a tree, the letter in his pocket a heavy reminder of everything he'd lost and gained. "I don't know how to feel," he admitted, his voice raw. "I'm so angry at her, but she's still my mom. And now I know my dad didn't leave because he didn't care. It's too much." Ezra stepped closer, his hands framing Julian's face. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight. You've got me, Sophia, Carmen, even Lena now. You're not alone in this." Julian leaned into his touch, grateful for the steadiness. "What if she never changes?" he asked, his voice small. "What if she can't accept us? Then we build our own family," Ezra said firmly, "with people who love us for who we are." "But I saw her face today, Julian. She's struggling." "That's a start." Julian nodded, though doubt lingered. They returned to the tent, where the reception was in full swing, guests laughing, clinking glasses, dancing under the twinkling lights. Sophia approached, her eyes red, but her smile bright. "You okay?" she asked, pulling Julian into a hug. "Yeah," he said, hugging her back. "Thanks for being here, Soph." "Always," she said, then glanced at Maria, who was now alone at the table. "She's trying, Julian. She's just scared." Julian followed her gaze, his heart heavy. He wanted to believe his mother could change, but the years of rejection made it hard. Still, her words from the stage echoed. "I was wrong. Maybe, just maybe, there's hope." As the night wore on, Julian and Ezra mingled with their guests, accepting congratulations and sharing stories. Lena joined them, telling tales of Ricardo's adventures, how he'd once spent a week photographing street performers in New Orleans, how he'd taught her to find beauty in the ordinary. Each story was a gift, a piece of the father Julian had lost. But as the reception neared its end, Maria stood, her movements hesitant. She approached Julian and Ezra, her hands clasped tightly. The tent seemed to quiet, all eyes on her. Julian braced himself, unsure what to expect. "I'm not good at this," Maria began, her voice low. "But I want to try. For you, Julian. For Sophia. I don't understand everything, but I don't want to lose you." Julian's heart pounded. It wasn't a full apology, not yet, but it was more than he'd ever expected. He glanced at Ezra, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to decide. "Okay," Julian said finally, his voice steady. "Let's start there." Maria's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, stepping back. The tension in the tent eased, and the music swelled again, pulling everyone back into the celebration. Julian felt Ezra's arm around his waist, grounding him, and for the first time that night, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. The reception stretched into the night, the tent alive with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of jazz. Julian and Ezra moved through the crowd, their hands rarely parting, their smiles a quiet triumph. The weight of the day, Maria's slap, Victor's revelation, Ricardo's letter, still lingered, but the joy of their union was stronger, a light cutting through the shadows. Julian caught glimpses of his mother throughout the evening. Maria stayed on the fringes, speaking little, her face a mix of exhaustion and something softer, regret perhaps. Sophia stayed close to her, ever the peacemaker, but Julian noticed Maria's eyes following him, watching as he laughed with Ezra, danced with Tia Carmen, and shared stories with Lena. Each glance felt like a question, one he wasn't ready to answer. As the band played a lively salsa tune, Ezra pulled Julian back to the dance floor. "You're thinking too much," Ezra teased, spinning him with a grin. "Just be here with me." Julian laughed, letting Ezra lead him through the steps. The guests cheered, some joining them, and for a moment, Julian felt weightless, carried by the music and the man he loved. But as the song ended, he saw Maria stand, her movements deliberate, and approach the microphone at the front of the tent. The band paused, and the crowd quieted, sensing another shift. Julian's stomach tightened, but Ezra's hand on his back kept him steady. "Let's hear her out," Ezra whispered. Maria cleared her throat, her hands trembling as she gripped the microphone. I wasn't going to speak tonight, she began, her voice unsteady but clear. I didn't think I had the right. But I need to say something to Julian and Ezra and to all of you. The guests leaned in, their faces a mix of curiosity and caution. Julian felt his heart race, unsure if he was ready for more. Maria's eyes found his, and for the first time, they held no anger, only vulnerability. When Julian was born, she said, her voice softening, I promised to protect him, to give him a life where he'd be safe, respected, loved. I thought I knew what that meant. I thought it meant teaching him the rules I was raised with, the ones my parents, my church, my community drilled into me. But today, I saw how wrong I was. Tears glistened in her eyes, and she paused, steadying herself. Julian, you've always been my pride, my heart. When you told me who you are, I was afraid, not of you, but of what the world would do to you. I thought I could protect you by making you fit into my world. But I see now that I was the one hurting you. And Ezra, she turned to him, her voice breaking. You love my son in a way I didn't think was possible. I'm sorry for trying to take that away. The tent was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Julian's throat tightened, his eyes burning. He wanted to believe her, but the years of pain made it hard. Ezra squeezed his hand, his voice low. She's trying, Julian. That's something. Maria continued, her voice stronger now. I can't undo what I've done. To you, Julian, or to your father. But I want to learn. I want to be part of your life if you'll let me. The crowd erupted into soft applause, some guests wiping tears, others nodding in approval. Sophia stood, hugging her mother tightly, her own tears falling. Julian felt a rush of emotions. Anger, hope, grief, love, all colliding. He looked at Ezra, whose eyes were steady, encouraging. Do you want to respond? Ezra asked quietly. Julian nodded, stepping toward the microphone. Maria moved aside, her eyes searching his face. He took a deep breath, his voice raw but clear. Mommy, I've spent my life trying to make you proud, even when it meant hiding who I am. Your words today, they mean something, but they don't erase everything. I want you in my life, but it has to be on my terms, with Ezra, with the truth. Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face. Understand, she said softly. I'll try. Julian stepped back, and Ezra pulled him into a hug, the crowd's applause growing louder. Victor approached, his eyes warm. You did good, kid, he said, clapping Julian on the shoulder. Your father would have been proud. The band struck up again, and the reception resumed, the energy lighter now, as if a weight had lifted. Julian and Ezra returned to the dance floor, their movements slower, more intimate. Lena joined them, sharing more stories of Ricardo, each one painting a fuller picture of the man Julian had lost but was beginning to know. As the night wound down, Tia Carmen approached, her silver hair glowing under the fairy lights. You two are stronger than you know, she said, her voice thick with emotion. And Maria, she's stubborn, but she loves you. Give her time. Julian nodded, glancing at his mother, who was now talking quietly with Sophia. I will, he said, but I'm done waiting for her to catch up. Carmen smiled, pulling him into a hug. That's my boy. As the guests began to leave, Julian and Ezra stood at the tent's entrance, saying their goodbyes. Lena handed Julian a small card with her contact information. If you ever want to talk more about your dad, I'm here, she said. He'd be so happy to see you like this. Julian tucked the card into his pocket, next to his father's letter. Thank you, he said, his voice thick, for everything. As the last guest departed, Julian and Ezra stood alone under the stars, the tent glowing softly behind them. Ezra pulled him close, his lips brushing Julian's forehead. We did it, he said, his voice warm. Yeah, Julian said, his smile tired but genuine. We did. But as they turned to leave, Julian saw Maria standing at the edge of the garden, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. She didn't approach, but she didn't walk away either. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start. And for tonight, that was enough. The night air was cool as Julian and Ezra left the reception, their hands intertwined, their wedding bands catching the moonlight. The garden was quiet now, the fairy lights dimming, the last strains of music fading into the distance. Julian felt the weight of the day settling into his bones, the slap, the letter, his mother's words. But with Ezra beside him, it was bearable. They walked toward their car, parked at the edge of the venue, the gravel crunching under their shoes. Julian glanced back at the tent, where a few stragglers were still gathering their things. Maria was among them, her figure small against the glowing backdrop. She hadn't approached him again, but her presence lingered, a question mark in the night. "You okay?" Ezra asked, his voice soft as he opened the car door. Julian nodded, sliding into the passenger seat. "Yeah, it's just a lot." Ezra leaned over, kissing him gently. "We'll figure it out. Together." As they drove back to their Brooklyn apartment, the city lights blurring past, Julian pulled his father's letter from his pocket. He traced the words with his finger, each one a piece of a man he'd never truly known but now felt closer to. Ricardo had loved him, had wanted him to be free. That knowledge was a gift, one Julian would carry forward. When they reached their apartment, Ezra unlocked the door, and they stepped inside, the familiar space a comfort after the chaos of the day. Their small living room was cluttered with art supplies. Ezra's sketches pinned to the walls, Julian's camera equipment stacked in a corner. It was their haven, a place where they'd build a life free from judgment. Julian sank onto the couch, the letter still in his hand. Ezra joined him, resting his head on Julian's shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About my dad," Julian said quietly. "About how he never got this. A day like today, with someone he loved, out in the open. I wish I could tell him I made it." Ezra lifted his head, his eyes soft. "He knows. Wherever he is, he knows." Julian smiled, leaning into Ezra's warmth. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the day settling into something softer, more hopeful. The future was uncertain. Maria's change of heart was fragile, and the wounds of the past wouldn't heal overnight. But Julian felt ready to face it, with Ezra by his side. The next morning, Julian woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Ezra humming in the kitchen. He stretched, his wedding band glinting in the sunlight, streaming through the window. For the first time in years, he felt unburdened, like he could breathe without the weight of his mother's expectations or his father's absence. He joined Ezra in the kitchen, wrapping his arms around him from behind. "Morning, husband," he said, his voice teasing. Ezra grinned, turning to kiss him. "Morning, husband. Ready for our honeymoon?" Julian laughed, the sound light and free. They'd planned a week in New Orleans, a nod to Ricardo's love for the city's vibrant streets. It felt fitting, a way to honor the father he was only now beginning to understand. As they packed, Julian's phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Mommy wants to talk when you're back." "No pressure, just she's trying. Love you." Julian showed the text to Ezra, who raised an eyebrow. "What do you think?" "I think I'll call her when we're ready," Julian said. "But today it's just us." Ezra nodded, pulling him close. "Just us." A week later, in New Orleans, Julian stood on a bustling street, his camera in hand, capturing the vibrant chaos of the French Quarter. Ezra stood beside him, sketching the same scene, their shoulders brushing. The air was thick with the scent of beignet and the sound of a trumpet in the distance. Julian felt his father's presence in the light, in the colors, in the freedom of this moment. He lowered his camera and looked at Ezra, whose smile was brighter than the sun. "Thank you," Julian said, his voice soft. "For what?" Ezra asked, still sketching. "For everything. For loving me. For being my family." Ezra set his sketchbook down and pulled Julian into a kiss, the world fading around them. "Always," he said. Back in Brooklyn, Julian would eventually sit down with Maria, listening as she tried to bridge the gap between them. It wouldn't be easy. There were years of pain to unpack, trust to rebuild. But it was a start. Sophia would be there, too, her quiet strength holding them together. Victor would visit, sharing more stories of Ricardo, helping Julian piece together the man he'd lost. Lena would send photos of Ricardo's work, each one a reminder of the beauty he'd seen in the world. But for now, in this moment, Julian was free. He was loved, not in spite of who he was, but because of it. And as he stood with Ezra under the New Orleans sun, he knew he'd found his truth, just as his father had wanted. The wedding had been a battlefield, but it had also been a beginning. A family fractured, a truth revealed, a love affirmed. Julian held Ezra's hand, his father's letter tucked safely in his bag, and stepped into their future, unafraid.